Hello and a very warm welcome. It's time once again for Africa News, and here are the headlines. No surprise in Algeria as Abdelaziz Bouteflika walks away with a landslide victory, taking over 80% in presidential polls. His main opponent slams the result, however, as fraud on a massive scale. At least 48 people seeking shelter in a UN peacekeeping compound were killed when armed civilians attacked the facility in Bor. UN spokesperson Joseph Contreras tells us exactly what happened. And a park in Democratic Republic of Congo takes to the silver screen in a film inspired by the dangers lurking in the World Heritage Site. Well, vowing not to accept the results, Ali Ben Flies, the main opponent to Abdelaziz Bouteflika, says the election was fraud on a massive scale. Ben Flies took just 12% of the vote, according to official results, pittance compared to the 81.5% taken by his rival. The 77-year-old Bouteflika has barely been seen in public since he suffered a stroke last year. But let's now take a look at the man who has secured his fourth term as president of Algeria.
A fourth term in power for a 77-year-old president who had to vote in a wheelchair. They called him the invisible candidate. He spent 3 months in a Paris hospital after a stroke last year, and in TV appearances to attack his rivals was so frail he could hardly be heard.
There have been calls for violence and very undemocratic behavior.
Bouteflika entered Algerian politics as the world's youngest foreign minister in 1963. Exiled from Algeria in the 70s thanks to conflict within his party, he returned after the 1990s civil war and was first elected to the presidency in 1999. Associated with the return to stability after years of war, he was then widely popular and used that advantage to lock down a system that suppresses dissent. Many boycotted the election, saying the result was a foregone conclusion.
People reject this election in every way. It's not an election. It's a farce. And the result is already known. I don't know how you can talk about popular sovereignty as the dice has already been thrown.
It's soaring unemployment and exploding food prices that have sent his popularity plunging. The opposition say the vote was rigged and they will reject the result.
Well, France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent is in the capital Algiers and has been following the election. She told us how, while no one was surprised by who won, they were taken aback by the extent of the win.
There was a gasp of surprise in the media centre. Hundreds of journalists there to hear this result. When the result was announced, 81.5% given for Abdelaziz Bouteflika. That provoked a reaction of surprise among the journalists covering this from Algeria and around the world. They said they weren't expecting it to be such a large margin, and that's something we've heard echoed on the streets of Algiers, people saying that for them this election was a foregone conclusion, that the real power play here in Algeria was behind the scenes. But nevertheless, there was a certain amount of shock that there was such a big margin, only 12.2% for the main opposition candidate, Ali Ben Flies. But what we're seeing tonight, there are fireworks exploding on the city skyline, people driving through the streets, blaring their horns. These are supporters of the president who's been elected for a fourth term, saying that they are reassured, happy that he's kept on at the helm, and for them this means stability and continuation in their way of life.
Indeed, then they mentioned stability, but what exactly are people in Algeria expecting of this 77-year-old in his fourth term?
Well, people we've spoken to say that they hope for more of the same. Supporters of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika say that they're just relieved that there's not been major instability surrounding this vote. And for them, they want to see that continue. People very concerned, of course, about any disruption or violence. Algeria has a long, troubled history, 10 years of civil war, which has really marked the population here. In terms of reforms that the government says it's going to put in place, well, the Prime Minister, who's a spokesman for the Bouteflika campaign, says that they're going to continue with economic reforms, notably looking at what they can do for the young population. More than two-thirds of the Algerian population are aged under 30, many of them unemployed. They said that's going to be one of their priority. There's also a question about whether there'll be a vice president put in place, a change to the constitution, because Abdelaziz Bouteflika is already 77 years old. He's in frail health. He suffered a minor stroke last year. And if he goes the full length of his 5-year mandate, well, he'd be into his 80s. So there's talk now of whether there'll be some constitutional change to try and change that and put a vice president who can help him run the country.
Catherine Norris-Trent there, our correspondent in Algeria. Well, kidnappers of a Tunisian diplomat taken captive in Tripoli this week have now laid out their demands. In exchange for the release of Al-Aroussi Kontasi, they want freedom for Libyans currently imprisoned in Tunisia on terrorism charges. Kontasi is the second Tunisian official to be abducted in Libya in as many months, and Tunisia has now issued a travel warning to its citizens, urging them to postpone any trips to Libya. Meanwhile, Tunisia's president, Monsef Marzouki, has decided to give himself a wage decrease. He says he will cut his pay by 2/3 in a message to the people of how seriously he's taking the current financial crisis rocking the country. According to officials, Marzouki was earning a net income of just over €9,000 a month. And some news just coming into us here in the France 24 newsroom. A bomb has exploded in the Egyptian capital, Cairo. One officer has been killed and another has been wounded. That's according to state media. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for that attack, but we will, of course, bring you more as soon as it comes into us. Now, in South Sudan, at least 48 people were killed and around 100 more wounded after armed youths forced their way onto the UN base in the town of Bor, just 100 kilometres north of the capital, Juba. And they attacked the civilians that were sheltering there. Just a short while ago, we spoke to Joseph Contreras, the acting spokesman for the UN mission there, and he told us that security had been stepped up after the 300 people dressed as civilians approached and started to attack civilians in the compound.
But as this mob approached the perimeter of our compound in Bor, our colleagues on the ground noticed that many of them were carrying a wide assortment of weapons, including firearms, and their mood seemed anything but peaceable. As they got closer and closer and angrier in tone, some of our peacekeepers fired warning shots in the air. The mob ignored the warning shots and managed to penetrate the protection of civilian site through a gate and breaches in the perimeter walls, and then opened fire on some of the estimated 5,000 civilians who we've been sheltering in that facility. Some of our peacekeepers then returned fire, and thereafter the mob withdrew from the protection of civilian site and fled the area altogether.
The director of VIRUNGA Park in Democratic Republic of Congo has been evacuated to Nairobi. Emmanuel Demerode was shot in the forest on Tuesday, but is now said to be in a stable condition and leaving to rest and be with his wife. Demerode has overseen the 800,000 hectares since 2008, a park that is known for its endangered gorillas, but is also being targeted by oil giants. The dark side of Virunga is the focus of a film at the Tribeca Festival in New York. Nicolas Germain brings us the review.
The documentary Virunga underlines the numerous threats faced by the national park. These include poachers, illegal loggers, oil companies and armed groups. Any one of these could be behind the attack this week against the park's director, Emmanuel Demerode. He was shot 4 times and badly wounded on Tuesday. Demerode is at the heart of the documentary.
Les villageois sont en train de fuir. Nous on reste ici. Oui. Je voulais juste savoir, pour la nourriture, pour les gorilles, on a combien de jours devant nous?
2 jours comme ça.
Les M23 sont à Roubaret, ok? S'ils ferment Moiro, ok? Oui. Nous on va devoir se débrouiller ici.
The film's director has been able to speak to Demerode.
He's doing okay. We spoke to him on the phone yesterday and he was already cracking a couple of jokes. So you know, it's a very close call and he's not out of the woods yet, but we're all positive and wishing him well.
The documentary focuses on British firm Soco International, which wants to explore for oil in the park. De Merode was shot just hours after filing a report criticising Soco's actions, but the company has strongly denied any involvement. Since 1996, more than 140 park rangers have been killed by poachers or armed groups. The rangers protect about a quarter of the world's remaining 800 mountain gorillas.
C'est ça ma vie. Ils ont l'amour.
The film also shows how civilians have to flee when rebel groups get too close. The documentary hopes to raise public awareness about the dangers faced by this UNESCO World Heritage Site, dangers that have become ever more apparent with the attack this week against the park's director.
Well, that's it from Africa News for this evening, and indeed it's the very last Africa News to have been produced by Charlotte Prudhomme, who has worked on the show since its creation last June, so a very big thanks to her. And I hope perhaps that she might come back to us very soon. All the very best, Charlotte. Well, that really is it from us for now, but Claire Murphy is back with more world news just after the break, so don't go anywhere.